My husband stood in front of a backyard full of his relatives, pointed at the door, and said, "Apologize right now, or get out." He expected tears. He expected me to fold, the way I always had. Instead, I looked at our sleeping son down the hall, looked back at my husband, and made a decision so quiet, so calm, that nobody at that party had any idea their whole world was about to end. 3 weeks later, I was gone, and he never saw it coming. If you've ever been told to shrink yourself to keep someone else comfortable, if you've ever bitten your tongue at a family dinner until it bled, this story is for you. Hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't, and settle in, because this is one of the most satisfying, quietly devastating stories of walking away that you will hear today. Let's get into it. My name is Hannah. I was 34 years old the night my husband gave me an ultimatum he never expected me to accept. By then, I had been married to Mark for 6 years. We had a 3-year-old son, Oliver, with his father's dark hair and my stubborn chin. A boy who loved fruit snacks and dump trucks, and falling asleep against my shoulder during car rides. On paper, my life looked complete: a husband who worked hard, a healthy son, a house with a yard. The kind of life people compliment you on at parties. But there is a particular kind of exhaustion that doesn't show up in photographs. It's the exhaustion of being watched, measured, graded, quietly, by people who never once considered that you might be grading them back. Mark wasn't a monster. I need you to understand that first, because this isn't a story about a villain who beat his wife or drained her bank account. Mark went to work every day. He came home and played with Oliver on the living room floor. He remembered our anniversary. In almost every measurable way, he was a good husband. Except for one thing. The moment his family entered a room, my husband disappeared, and in his place stood a different man entirely. A son first, a brother first, a defender of people who had never once defended me. His mother, Diane, had opinions about everything. The way I diced vegetables, the cut of my jeans, the tone of my voice when I asked Oliver to put on his shoes. At first I told myself I was being too sensitive. Then I told myself it was cultural, generational, harmless. Then, somewhere around year 3, I stopped telling myself anything at all. I just absorbed it. The way you absorb a cold room, you stop noticing you're shivering. Every time I brought it up to Mark, I got the same 7 words back, delivered like a closing argument. That's just how they are. As if that settled it. As if the weather couldn't be argued with. So I learned to disappear a little at every gathering. Smaller opinions, smaller reactions, smaller self. I told myself this was what marriage costs sometimes. A small, manageable tax on peace. I didn't know yet that peace bought this way isn't peace. It's just delayed collapse. The day everything cracked open started ordinarily enough. A Saturday barbecue at Mark's parents' house, the kind they hosted every few weeks. Dozens of relatives spilled across the backyard. Kids shrieked through a sprinkler. Someone's playlist rotated between country and old pop songs. On the surface, it looked like joy. Oliver sat beside me at the long picnic table, working through a plate of cut fruit. When Diane appeared behind him, like she'd been summoned for anything resembling parental decision-making, she looked down at his plate, and her mouth tightened into that particular frown I'd catalogued 100 times. "You're still limiting his sugar," she said, loud enough for the table to hear. "His pediatrician recommended it," I answered, keeping my voice level. "The way you keep your hands steady around something breakable." She rolled her eyes. An actual, visible eye roll, the kind you'd expect from a teenager. "That's ridiculous." A few heads turned. I felt the old, familiar tightening in my chest. The pre-storm pressure drop I'd learned to recognize years ago. "I'm just following his doctor's advice," I said again, quieter this time, hoping quiet would end it. It didn't. Mark's sister Rachel leaned into the conversation with the ease of someone joining a game she already knew the rules to. "Oh, come on, Hannah. One parenting article and suddenly you're an expert." Laughter rippled down the table. My face went hot. I did what I always did. I forced a smile, the reflex of 6 years of practice. But something in me, that day, simply refused to keep smiling. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was watching Oliver's small face flick between the adults, trying to read whether something was wrong. Whatever it was, for the first time in longer than I could remember, I didn't let it go. I don't think following medical advice is something to be mocked, I said. The table went quiet in that specific way tables go quiet right before they turn on someone. Diane folded her arms. There you go again. There I go what? Being disrespectful. The word landed like a slap. Disrespectful, for defending a pediatrician's recommendation about my own son's diet. I looked around the table, waiting for someone, anyone, to notice how absurd that sentence was. Instead, I watched the story rewrite itself in real time, the way it always did. Within minutes, I wasn't a mother defending a boundary. I was the difficult one. The problem. The woman who always makes things hard. And then I looked at Mark. I want you to sit with this moment, because it's the hinge the entire story turns on. I looked at my husband, and all I needed from him was one sentence. Hannah has a point. Let's drop it. 6 words. That's all it would have taken. He said nothing. He sat there, watching his wife get dismantled at a picnic table, and said absolutely nothing. That silence hurt worse than anything his mother or sister had said all afternoon. Rachel added one more comment, something about how I always made family events difficult. And that was the moment. 6 years of swallowed responses finally came up. I didn't yell. I didn't insult anyone. I simply, calmly, told the truth. I told them what years of criticism does to a person. I told them how tired I was of being the family's designated target, the one everyone got to sharpen their opinions on. The reaction was immediate, and it was unanimous. Every single person at that table turned on me, including Mark. He stood up, jaw tight, and said, Hannah, stop. I looked at him. No. The backyard went silent. Somewhere behind us, a sprinkler kept ticking back and forth, oblivious. Mark's face was a mixture of embarrassment, frustration, and something close to panic. The look of a man who has spent 6 years avoiding a reckoning and suddenly finds it standing in his own backyard. And then he said the sentence that would end our marriage, as we both understood it. Apologize right now, or get out. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Every face at that table wore the same expectation, that I would fold, the way I always had. That I'd mutter an apology, swallow my pride, and let the party resume. Instead, I stood up. I walked inside. I gathered Oliver's things, and I left. No shouting. No dramatic exit line. Just silence. The loudest thing I had ever said to that family. That night, after I'd put Oliver to bed, I sat alone at our kitchen table and replayed the entire day. And for the first time, I saw it clearly. The problem was never that single argument. The problem was 6 years of arguments just like it. 6 years of being expected to absorb insult after insult so the family could keep calling itself close. Around midnight, a memory surfaced. 3 years earlier, an old friend, Sophia, living overseas, had offered me a position at her growing company. Life had been different then. I'd said no, politely, the way you decline something you don't yet realize you'll need. I opened my laptop. I typed a message I didn't expect much from. Sophia replied within the hour. The position was still open. The company had grown. They needed someone immediately. I stared at the screen for a long time. For the first time in years, I wasn't asking anyone's permission for anything. The hardest part of what came next wasn't the planning. It was the performing. For 2 weeks, I lived a double life. By day, I dropped Oliver at preschool, answered work emails, made dinner, smiled when smiling was expected of me. By night, I rebuilt my entire future, one item at a time, a checklist nobody else could see. Sophia's offer wasn't a fantasy job. It was something sturdier than that. A fresh start, in New Zealand. With a company that wanted me specifically for what I could do, not for how quietly I could disappear into a room. I handled every detail with the seriousness of a woman building a life. Raft, housing, paperwork, school options for Oliver, financial planning. Every decision passed through a single filter. Will this make my son's life healthier? If yes, I moved forward. If no, I didn't. That was the whole test. Meanwhile, Mark behaved exactly as I'd predicted, which told me everything I needed to know about how well he understood me, or rather, how little. At first, he barely mentioned the fight. Then the texts started, short and testing the water. You ready to talk? We should move past this. Mom feels bad. That last one nearly made me laugh out loud in an empty kitchen. Not because it was funny, because it was so perfectly telling. Nobody was asking how I felt. Everyone was managing how they felt about what I'd done by finally speaking. Diane called, repeatedly. Rachel texted about family unity. Relatives I hadn't spoken to in months suddenly wanted to check in. Every message wanted peace. Not one of them offered accountability. So I stopped. I stopped arguing. Stopped explaining. Stopped defending myself in a courtroom where the verdict had been decided before I ever opened my mouth. And I discovered something that would change how I moved through the rest of my life. Silence is a kind of power nobody warns you about. People can't twist your words if you stop handing them words to twist. 3 weeks after the barbecue, everything was ready. The apartment, the job, Oliver's school enrollment, the tickets, an entire future, built in secret, sitting quietly in a folder on my laptop. The night before we left, Mark came home carrying takeout from my favorite restaurant, the old peace offering, the one that had worked a dozen times before. We sat at the kitchen table while Oliver slept upstairs, and I felt, for a moment, the pull of 6 years of habit. I think we've dragged this out long enough, he said, sliding a container toward me. I looked at him for a long moment. I agree. He smiled, relieved, certain the smile of a man who believed he had won something. I knew you'd come around. I almost felt sorry for him in that moment. Almost the next morning, while Mark was at work, Oliver and I drove to the airport. I left a letter on the kitchen counter. Nothing cruel. Nothing dramatic. Just honest. An explanation of why I was leaving, what would have needed to change for me to stay, and why I refused to spend one more year teaching our son that love means tolerating disrespect to keep other people comfortable. My phone started buzzing halfway through airport security calls, texts, voicemails, stacking up by the dozen. Mark had found the letter. I didn't answer. Not for several hours. Not until Oliver was asleep beside me, 30,000 feet over an ocean, his small hand curled against my arm. Hannah, Mark said the second I picked up, his voice cracked in a way I'd never heard before. You're actually doing this. I looked out the window. Clouds stretched endlessly below us, indifferent to the entire conversation. Yes, this is insane. No, I said, and I meant it, calmly, the way you state a fact you've already made peace with. What's insane is thinking I'd spend the next 20 years apologizing for having boundaries. He didn't answer. For the first time since I'd met him, my husband didn't have an argument ready. That silence on the other end of the phone, that was the moment justice arrived. Not with a shout, not with a scene. With the quiet, total absence of anything Mark could say in his own defense. He had spent 6 years assuming my compliance was permanent. That's just how they are would work forever. That I would always choose the family's comfort over my own dignity. Instead, he was standing in an empty house, holding a letter, while his wife and son were already somewhere over the Pacific, building a life he had no part in. The months that followed were not easy. Starting over rarely is. But Oliver flourished in a way I hadn't dared to hope for. He grew lighter, more confident, more himself. Freed from a household thick with tension he was too young to name, but old enough to absorb, and so did I. Distance did something Mark's own family never could. It forced him to see clearly, without a chorus of relatives drowning out the truth, the favoritism, the years of dismissiveness. The way keeping the peace had always meant my silence, never theirs. Eventually, he apologized, a real one, not for a single argument, but for years of choosing comfort over courage. Diane and Rachel apologized too, months later, only once they understood they no longer controlled how this story ended. Today, My relationship with Mark is healthier than it has ever been. Not because I forgave everything overnight, but because boundaries finally exist where none did before. Looking back, the plane ticket wasn't the important part. Neither was the new country. The important part was realizing something simple. Respect isn't something you beg for. It's something you decide you're no longer willing to live without. The night my husband told me to apologize or leave, he thought he was handing me a punishment. He never realized he was handing me a choice, and choosing myself changed everything. If this story hit you somewhere real, smash that like button and let us know in the comments. Have you ever had to choose yourself over people who expected your silence forever? Subscribe for more stories like Hannah's, and we'll see you in the next one.